Hey, this is probably going to be another two-part uh, vidcast. Not because these are, well, not because I'm trying to be long-winded, but because on one hand, these values are Japanese. On the other hand, a lot of this is actually, I would call Asian. And you really want to be able to wrap your head around how these actually work. Not so much, as memorizing it, but actually sort of, empathize with it, try to figure out what it would be like to be in that situation, not be these people, but to actually interact with these people. So Japanese social values. The key one, and this is foundational to Japanese society, and this is uniquely Japanese. Koreans and Chinese don't have this. They have very, bilateral or bidirectional relationships. I should point out all Asian relationships. In fact, I'd say relationships in almost all societies. I'm not sure about American society confuses me. But outside of American society, it's important to remember that relationships occur over time. So even a concept of a balanced relationship, you do someone a favor. There's not the concept they're supposed to immediately reciprocate the favor. In fact, in many cases, it's certainly true in Hawaii with almost all the ethnic groups in Hawaii. The attitude is what you want to do is you want to build up like a stockpile of favors you've done for people, and sort of save them, almost like a savings account. And it actually is. It's a social savings account, with the idea that at some point when you need it, you've got all these people that you can hit up for return of favors. And this is the huge game playing with gift giving, whether it be the Japanese omiyagi, whether it be coming back from somewhere and giving treats to friends at work or whatever. Um, this is all part of that sort of bidirectional, time-based system. Really, social relationships occur over time. They're not situationally specific. They're situationally like tips of an iceberg. You're seeing a situation, but there's a lot more context that's hidden. Um, Amae is unique as far as I know. It translates. It really doesn't translate to English. Mothering is the technical term. If you look at a dictionary. Um, but what really is, it's the wish to be indulged. It's the desire to have someone take care of you, and to know that that's going to happen automatically, that you don't have to negotiate it, that it's a given, that person will always take care of you. But the key here is they'll indulge you in the sense that they'll take care of you, but in general, they will not provide any sort of critique of your behavior. So if you do something wrong, they'll just take care of you. They won't sit there and give you a lot of crap about, well, you should have thought of this and you shouldn't have done that. And da, 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 da. So lecturing is not a part of mine. A key part of it on the indulged versus indulger, I don't know, would be that the indulged is helpless like a child, like a little kid. In other words, they're entirely unable to get out of whatever they are or resolve a situation without the support of the mother, without the indulger. Yeah, I guess that's the term. So it's unidirectional. Now, the key thing about this is in each relationship, they don't change. The indulger and the indulged are always the same. So it's a one-way street. It's like going down Baratania. You only got one direction to go. Having said that, during their lives, every individual will be in some situations, they'll be indulgers. In other situations, they'll be the indulged. As you go through life, theoretically, though, again, it varies. Any relationship you get into that's of any value. So this goes back to our time last time about relationships and the fact that Japanese view all relationships as emotional. This is why all relationships are emotional, because all relationships, if they're of any utility at all, if they're anything outside of just formality, uh, maybe what you would call an acquaintance in American English. So you don't really there's no consequence to stuff. It's just sort of like somebody you know. But the minute there's consequence, at that point, the MI system sets up. So every person will be in one or the other of those two positions. And that's an MI relationship. That's the only, I would argue, that's the only actual emotional social relationship the Japanese have. Whether it be mother and child, whether it be senior and junior at the workplace, whether it be even classmates. Think of those kids we saw. That's going to all be defined by Amae relationships. Someone's going to be the generator, if you would. Someone's going to be the sponge, and the generator would be the indulged person. They get to behave in, childish or emotional or whatever ways. They get to behave in ways that have no consequences with the person they're in the Amae relationship with, because they don't have to worry about there being some sort of judgment of their behavior. The indulger in the Amae relationship is the sponge. They just take in all this, crap and other stuff this person gives them, and they just support that person. They don't respond to them. They don't critique them. They don't Monday morning quarterback. I don't know if that's still a term. Um, that relationship. In another relationship, the person that's the sponge or the indulger in one relationship will be the child or the indulged in the second relationship, and there'll be someone else that'll be the sponge for them. Um, Now this is probably the most strikingly seen actually in the workplace. I don't think mother-child relationships. I don't think people really think about it because it really doesn't look that different than mother-child relationships in a lot of societies, because it's sort of hard to see this, unidirectional pattern to it unless you look at it over time. Though if you watch kids, especially from the age of like 6 to 14, with their mother, you can notice if you're looking for it, you can see it. But I don't think it's something that's really striking. For example, for watching Japanese tourists out, say Alamoana or something like that. Um, Key here is everyone in their life has multiple relationships. Some they're on one side of this thing, some they're on the other, on one side of the one-way street. Sometimes they're on the other end of the one-way street. Japanese can't function without this. This is to them a relationship that's worth spending any time on. Is by definition an Amae relationship. So there's no idea of having a balanced relationship. That where two folks are I don't know how to say comparable parts of a whole. Um, so the idea of sort of the classic American stereotype of a husband and wife or something like that, where they're a matching set. Japanese would watch your lips move and they think matching set, but they'd immediately translate that to one's going to be the sponge, one's going to be the generator. This is the only model they've got. This makes it very difficult for Japanese when they move somewhere else, whether it be China, whether it be Korea, whether it be Hawaii, US, whatever. They don't have other important relationships other than this. So a relationship where you've got two folks that are basically equal halves or complementary parts of a relationship, they just don't. Yeah, that's like speaking Martian. It's not part of the way the system works. It doesn't mean they can't learn it, but it does mean that they're going to have this enormous, sort of culture shock if they go back to Japan or deal, with Japanese on one hand and deal with non-Japanese on the other. I know this from friends of mine. They have a very difficult time between their Japanese relationships, which they actually sort of keep mentally in one box, and their non-Japanese relationships, which they mentally keep in another box. And the two, you can't mix the two boxes together. They're totally different types of things. So if you want to see this, and maybe I showed you before, the mom and the kid. This is the stereotype of an Amae relationship. The mother's the sponge. The child is the generator. Now, as that kid kicks up and that kid becomes 10 years old, 20 years old, 40 years old, that relationship won't change. The dynamics and the structure of the relationship are exactly the same. Till, the kid's 40, 50 years old and the mom's, 70s or something like that. The kid's still going to act like a child around the mom. And it's sort of surreal. Japanese don't do this in public normally, but you can occasionally get a glimpse of it. And it's sort of weird to watch a salaryman who's in his 40s or 50s suddenly turn in almost like a childlike behavior with his mother, when you know that if he's in the workplace, he's oftentimes the oil bin. So he's like this sort of tough samurai attitude type guy. All of a sudden around his mom, he's like a 10-year-old kid. And almost like schizophrenic, and it isn't. It's just Japanese. So this relationship is permanent. My relationships never get renegotiated. I'm sure it must happen, but I'm not sure. I would think if my relationship sort of breaches, what would happen is the two parties would just cease to have any association because you don't have any other type of relationship you can have, and you can't change how the relationship works. This is one thing that makes Japanese very uncomfortable when they get old and their parents are really old, is that they'll actually sometimes mention it to you sort of in passing, especially if they've been drinking and they're having emotional issues with it, is how they, they've got a parent who's maybe got Alzheimer's. It's not really here, conceptually or mentally, and yet they don't know how to handle that because they've always been the kid. That's the sponge, and the sponge can't be anything other than a sponge. Now, this also, just as a note, this goes back to what I think I said last time. All Japanese relationships, one, are emotional. Two, Japanese society is very, I guess, behaviorally conservative. I don't know if that's a term. They don't have the fact that they don't have alternatives, the fact that you can't change role behaviors, really almost sort of fossilizes or structures Japanese society, makes it very hard for people individually and collectively to deal with change, which I've mentioned before, and I'll undoubtedly mention again. Sorry about that. Now the other part of so keep in mind that Japanese society can't function without Amae, and Japanese society doesn't have an alternative behavioral relationship to Amae. Now, what that means, of course, is husband and wives. This is where you see the most striking. It's been husband and wives. You would think, well, okay, the husband, it's a patrilocal society, so therefore the guys are in charge, so therefore they should be the sponge. No, 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 no. In Japanese relationships, the wife is the sponge, the husband is the generator. So in many ways, the wife takes on the same role behavior that the guy has with his mom. Now, this can get complicated. In fact, if people go out drinking, can not infrequently hear this. What this frequently does is it puts the wife sort of in competition with the mom for his emotional time and interest. If he spends too much time with the wife, and she's becoming too good of a sponge to his, childlike behavior, then the mother's going to feel like she's been slighted. And so you not infrequently can end up with sort of like competition where who can be the best emotional mother for the childlike, husband/son. And this is actually a staple of Japanese literature too. So, certainly you see it with Japanese soap operas, God knows. So this is the Japanese relationship. Um, yeah, yeah, it is what it is. And I mean, since the whole society is structured like this, what this means, among other things, is a kid, especially a boy, especially a son, is a mirror of his mother. So if he does things well, that's because his mother does a good job, emotionally supporting him, encouraging him, et cetera, et cetera. If he doesn't do well, then it's her fault. So you see this classically in education. In Japanese education, if kids are doing well in the classroom, that's because of their mothers. Now, Chinese actually have sort of the same thing. It's like they call them tiger dragon mom or something. I don't know. If you go back about 10 years ago or something, there was a big thing on Instagram and stuff like that about, I think, especially Taiwanese mothers and how brutally how brutally they controlled their kids' behavior to make sure the kids would be a success. Japanese wouldn't have the, you've got to do this now, I'm going to lock you in a room type thing. But the idea that the kid's success is entirely dependent on the mother would be entirely understandable too. They would be horrified at what Chinese mothers would do to, not to their kids, but sort of, emotionally just sort of put them over the coals. And I've seen this with friends of mine. If the kids aren't doing well enough in terms of the parents' expectations in school, the mom will be all over their ass. You can't have any phone time. You can't spend time doing this. You can't spend time doing that. You got to spend another 4 hours, in your schoolwork. Most of the Chinese that I know in Hawaii that are actually from China they expect the kids, from first, second grade on, to be spending their time in schoolwork from the time they get home till basically about midnight to 1 or 2 in the morning, doing schoolwork, either schoolwork in terms of homework or getting ahead in the schoolwork. So they're going to be ahead of everyone else in the class. That's a very Chinese logic. And it's even worse in China. I should point out that when the Chinese in Hawaii are actually sort of like toned down from their Chinese counterparts, I would argue. In Japanese society, what had happened is something sort of similar, but what will happen is rather than dictating to the kids what they're going to do, what the mom will do is hint to the kids and provide them with treats and make sure that everything's perfect to make the kid feel guilty, because this is the other half of my relationship, to make the kid feel guilty so that the kid will then perform and do what the mother wants them to. So in Chinese society, there's a combination of, sort of, this can get pretty dramatic, like, the mom sort of, putting her hand up to her head and saying, oh no, all the effort and time and, and I raised you and this is the way you treat me type thing. Chinese can get pretty dramatic. Koreans are even more so. Korean mothers are spectacular in terms of the way they can sort of dramatize the situation with their kids to get the kids to do something. Japanese mothers blackmail their kids. What they do is they sniff. I mean, the classic situation being in my relationship, and I've actually seen this with a friend of mine, is the daughter wasn't doing what the mom thought she said. Now, I should point out the daughter in this case was in her mid-late 20s. And the mom had made it pretty clear what she wanted the daughter to do. And the daughter wasn't doing it. I should point out the daughter had been born in Hawaii, so she wasn't quite, you might say, in tune with what mom says type thing. So what happened is the mom did the classic Japanese mother thing. She started playing older music from when the kid was little, when the girl was little. She went and pulled out a photo album of baby pictures of the girl when she was young. And then she started cooking the girl's favorite foods, all the while sniffling in the kitchen. It was pure acting. It was way over the top, but it was pure acting. It was very impressive. You almost, since we were visiting at the time, you almost wanted to stand up and applaud. I mean, it was real knee-jerk soap opera behavior, and it worked. I mean, here she is in her 20s, flight attendant for major airlines. Okay, I mean, she didn't actually say okay, but all of a sudden, I reconsidered and I'll relook at this. Immediately, mom's all happy. The treats, the snacks come out, the photo album goes away, the music goes off, and everything's back the way it should be. That's Amae, and anytime if you deal with Japanese, you'll see this. It's fun to watch. I wouldn't want to have it done on me, but boy, it's effective. So in the education situation, this is oftentimes, there's a slang for this, is kyoikyu mama. Kyoikyu being sort of a slang term for classroom and homework and a bunch of other stuff rolled into one. And so what happens typically in Japan, if the kid's sick, or, well, I can't imagine this, but the kid decides they don't want to go to school that day, then what will happen is the mom will actually go to school and take their classes for them. Not to, take any tests or anything like that, but to take all the notes to make sure the kid doesn't lose any traction in the rest of the classroom. And then also will then, of course, talk to the teachers. The amount of time that teachers have to spend, I'm not sure if counseling would be the word, but interacting with mothers, like the student or the classroom kids' mothers, is by American standards stunning. In the classic situation with friends I have that teach at elementary levels, they say it's hard to get parents to go in to visit with the teachers. In the Japanese system, I would think the problem with our teachers is keeping the parents out. And I have to remember, from a rather cynical point of view, in Japanese society, on one hand, everyone in that classroom we'll say it's a classic, stereotypic Japanese classroom. So everyone in that classroom is part of the same neighborhood, one. Everyone in that classroom is from the same neighborhood. That means they're in social relationships, two. And they're then in junior, senior relationships with each other, three. So that the classroom's actually a package. That group and then the class below them or the class above them won't be a package. They'll oftentimes be in competition. Of course, parallel classrooms are in competition. But on one hand, that classroom and the folks in it, those kids that we saw in the picture, hang on a second. So again, our kids on the field trip. So in this group, since they're part of the same class, they have to be doing the other trip together. You've got already these kids are all in some sort of pretty complex Amae relationship. It's a good bet that the girls, especially this one, just strikes me as being so adult. It's a good bet that she's the sponge, if you would, for some of the other kids in this group. Yeah, I'm not sure who I sort of guess. My guess would be this: the boy here is actually probably also a sponge for somebody. I can almost guarantee he's a generator. Her, I don't know, but I can guarantee that if these two have a relationship, she's the sponge. She's the adult mother half of the direction, and he's the generator, the kid part. And this was what 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. What this means is if you segue suddenly ahead to 2036 and you find these two folks, one, they'll still be in a relationship. They're still, because they're classmates. And again, in Japan, this never disappears. By then they'll be married and probably have their own kids, but there'll still be a social network of these folks. Secondly, is that the relationship will still be the same. She'll still be, and I would bet in the majority of relationships she's the sponge. Just because she behaviorally seems pretty adult here. I can guarantee in maybe 50% of his relationships, he's the sponge because now he's an adult. And the other half, especially with her and his mom and stuff like that, he's still a generator. And to a certain extent, you could look at some kid, we'll say he's now hypothetically in his 40s, and you're still going to see this kid behaviorally. I'm actually in the background here, just noticing this. Here you've got, I bet I can almost guarantee this is the teacher. And here, God knows where this kid was, maybe to go to the restroom, or I don't know, whatever's. But this teacher is an interesting situation. The teacher has an Amae relationship with all the folks in the class because he's the Oyabun, if you would, and they're all Kobun in the sense that he's the senior, they're the juniors. But it's probably not terribly close because from his standpoint, every year, he ends up with a new group of folks. From their standpoint, this is actually their neighbors, including the kid over here. He's the teacher in the school, so he's some sort of an abstracted authority figure. So it makes Japanese and my relationships can get very nuanced, I guess, for lack of a better term. But nonetheless, they're always there, and they're always the same. So these kids are on Amae. Now, if he gets sick and can't go to class one day, then the mom will immediately contact the teacher and say, "Could I sit in the back of the classroom and take notes because so and so, is ill today?" And the teacher would never think of saying no. It's like, yeah, okay, no problem. So the parents, especially, I should say the mothers, have a complex relationship with the teacher also. Now, the interesting thing about this, when you think about it, is the Japanese educational system is highly competitive, like it is in all of Asia. In fact, a lot of in Asia, probably more so than any place else I know of. Certainly not like the United States. So what that means is if these kids want to get into, I don't know, we'll say Nagoya University. I know there's a couple of big universities in Nagoya. We'll say Nagoya has a big university. I'm sure they do. And we'll say these kids want to get into it. The number of slots open is going to be very, very small. So for the kids that are this age, I'd be willing to, I'm just guessing here, but I'd say there maybe would be one freshman slot opening for someone to get into Nagoya University. Now, these kids will have gone through elementary school and high school together, but at some point, by the time they're in their second or third, by a couple of years before now, when they're younger than this, they will have already had pretty strong hints. In fact, become pretty explicit by now that if she gets in, they don't. If he gets in, they don't. So you have this real sort of stress factor on the idea of social relationships, my relationships and social relationships in general in Japan, that they're on one hand supportive, your neighbors, your neighbors, your closest bond, the folks under the same roof almost. On the other hand, there's only, for positions of authority, prestige, or even especially getting into good schools, there's a very, very small number of slots available. And if one of them gets successful, that means the other ones didn't make it. So on some hand, these kids are also competing with each other in a very explicit fashion. When they go into middle school or intermediate school, um, what'll happen is all the grades these kids have acquired in elementary school, which is what these kids are, will be factored in along with essays they've written and stuff like that to decide if they're going to get into good intermediate schools. I should point out in Japan, as in the rest of Asia, the educational system is based on the, well, actually, I think it's still in place, the German system, which is a very, quote, efficient, unquote, system. So what you have is everyone gets general education through elementary school. On the other hand, everyone's being monitored in terms of their skill levels, their aptitudes, et cetera, throughout the thing. And that's probably why people stay a little distant from the teacher. On the one hand, the teacher's, the head of their class, and he's going to be sort of a buddy. On the other hand, they know that he's basically writing up reports every year on their behavior that's going to impact their entire future. So you can't be too close of friends with the boss, you might say. So what's going to happen is when they go into intermediate schools in Japan, I have two tiers to them. One is what you might call a college prep middle school. The other, what you might call, are vocational prep middle schools. And so what's going to happen, we'll just say arbitrarily, we got 1, 3, is there a girl behind me somewhere? Yeah, there's another person behind me. It says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids here. We'll say that 2 or 3 are going to get into the college prep high-end intermediate schools or middle schools. The other 4 are going to be in vocational middle schools. Now, for some of them and their families, that might be okay. If the dad is, for example, a blacksmith, which is highly prestigious, or the family is famous for weaving brocade silk or something like that, which, is highly popular actually in Takayama, the family tradition. They're sake brewers. So, from a young age, there might be an expectation that this boy here, actually, he looks a better choice, that this guy here is actually going to take over the family business. So they're not going to be all that agitated about whether he gets into, the world's not going to end if he doesn't get into a college tiered, middle school. On the other hand, we'll say that her family really wants their girl to get ahead. So she might already be under an enormous amount of pressure to do well in school and to always toe the line and always make sure that he's writing up good reports on her behavior so that she can guarantee get a position into a good middle, college directional middle school. Each middle school then kind of routes people both directions. Vocational schools, get a few students that, are sort of misplaced, you might say, and suddenly sort of blossom, I guess you might say, in middle school. And so therefore they'll find themselves routed to the college level high schools or the college direction high schools. A good chunk of the class, especially in rural areas like here, good chunk of these kids will end up in vocational high schools. Now these aren't bad schools. In fact, they're really good. The key here is they're actually training the folks in the classroom to be successful in the real world of business and stuff like that. So they're going to have more business classes. They're going to have, everything, a lot of computer training, but it's going to be vocational computer training. On the other hand, the college prep classes college prep high schools tend to be pretty esoteric. They're very much like their European counterparts. They're, a lot of sort of, not exotic, but, what would be called liberal arts courses in the United States. And what that means is when these kids graduate from high school, they're already on 2 entirely, well, this is very elegant. They're on, here's 2 college, here's 2 career paths. This is the college career path, it's the small one. Here's the vocational career path here. By the time they're in elementary school, which one of these they go is pretty much already defined. And with 1 or 2 exceptions, by the time they're in middle school, and especially by the time they finish middle school, which of these 2 paths they follow is almost predetermined. And certainly, through high school, it doesn't change. Having said that, going to a college prep high school doesn't mean you're going to get into college. The colleges are very rigid, very strict. And I should point out, actually, in many ways, very arbitrary in terms of how they pick students to come in as new students as freshmen. Um, and so even if all these kids went through college prep high schools, there's no guarantee they're going to get into even a decent college. Now, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, this is one reason that there were a fair number of students. We had a lot of Japanese students at Chaminade in the 70s and 80s. And the reason for that was, if this girl here doesn't get into the Japanese universities that her family wants her to, say she didn't get into Nagoya or one or two others, then what's going to happen? One option they had that was pretty popular was she'll then apply and come to, say, Chaminade or some other university in the United States or Europe, but usually the US, because that has the advantage. You have community colleges in Japan, but their status and prestige would be, if anything, even lower than they are in the United States. They're generally seen as places for folks that can't get into a decent university, to the extent that it would be very typical. I would say in this group of, we got 7 kids, that one or two will try to get into universities, don't get the ones they want. And what you become, is the slang term in Japanese is ronin, is what you actually do is you take a year off. You restudy for the entrance exams. You spend nothing for the next 11 months studying for the entrance exams to try again to get into Nagoya University second time around. It's real typical to bump into Japanese students at a Japanese university that 2, 3, or maybe even 4 years to get into that university. If it's a real prestigious ones, like the big ones in Kyoto U, for example, I would bet a large proportion of their students probably are second or third year before they get in successfully. Now, what that also means, of course, is you've got students who are in their second or third tries competing with the students that are on their first try for the same few freshman slots. So you can see pretty quickly, this is like a traffic jam. It's like the freeway backing up. You've got an ever increasing number of students, but the number of slots open doesn't increase. So American universities through the 80s were sort of like an escape valve, because if they get into USC or something like that, or UH Manoa, and when they graduate from UH Manoa, they go back to Japan. Folks in Japan sort of think, well, they probably couldn't get into a Japanese university. That's why they did that. On the other hand, depending on what they've studied, for example, if they studied international business or something like that, there might be, the parents were pretty clever. This person now has a different degree that they wouldn't have been able to get in Japan, because that's not what Japanese universities teach. And so therefore, this was a very clever move not to sidestep their failure to get into a Japanese university, but to actually provide them with a more elegant career path. As we'll see, there's problems with how this plays out, but that was actually pretty typical. In fact, some of my graduates at Chaminade actually did have done very well in Japan, because by going, taking like international business or some other thing that was more internationally focused, they really looked like they were making an intentional move to a non-Japanese university, not by virtue of failure. In at least 2 cases, they were doing it intentionally. They had actually got into good Japanese universities and decided that Chaminade was a better choice for where they wanted to be with their futures. And of course, this was driven by the family, i.e., the mother. So these kids are in many ways are representative of that situation now. And then in my relationship, what that also means, these kids are constantly being, I don't see manipulation, sort of a harsh term, but it's accurate. They're being manipulated to achieve that goal, regardless of whether the kids are really stoked with it or not, because that's what the mom wants. So therefore, the kids' success when they get into that will be a reflection of the mother. It's not the kids. Okay. Now, the other part of this, and I would argue in some ways this is like the balance to unidirectional social relationships and sort of the constraining nature of neighbors. In Japanese society, everyone's they're not under a microscope, but there's very clear expectations of how people should act. And that's very much defined by the neighborhood and the neighbors, and especially the mom, and your Oyab and Koban relationships and all that stuff. So Japanese are actually they live in an incredibly structured society, and when I'm talking to my Chinese relatives and friends, there's always, those that have spent time with the Japanese are constantly shaking their heads saying, those poor buggers, they're trapped, they're like they're on a railroad, they're going somewhere, but they're not really driving. They're just sort of, they're on the rails. And that would, in part, that's sort of true. I would say it's sort of, by Chinese standards, it is. Chinese have a lot more flexibility in terms, individuals in terms of the expectations are there, but how they attain the expectations, how they make success happen. There's a lot more freedom to do that in interesting ways. That's not true in Japan. Having said that, the Japanese have an interesting term, and it's actually something I think certainly should apply in America. So I would argue, especially with the impacts of social media and now AI and all the rest of this, more and more there's an enormous need for this particular concept, and we do not have this at all in the United States. And this is due to the idea that the fact that Americans are very externally focused. Japanese are very internally focused. Let me just jump ahead and see if I've got that there. Crap, right now. Okay. The concept is ikigai. Ikigai is Koreans, I can't say. Chinese have something sort of like this, but it's not as expressed. Ikigai in Japanese society means that from the time you're little, you develop a strong sense of who you are, in terms of what your strengths and weaknesses are, what makes you valuable, on what your self-worth is. This is entirely internally developed. So mom can support you, but because mom doesn't critique you, mom's not really going to be a direct, I would argue, maybe shaper, for lack of a better term, of ikigai. So ikigai is something you develop in your internal experience. So those kids we were just looking at, by the time they're that age, they already have a strong sense of ikigai. And if you talk to them, you can find this out. They'll be pretty clear about this. So this is internally developed. So Japanese developed their self-identity, as a psychologist would say. That's internal. It's not based on external factors. Now, this is, I would argue, so if Japanese society, who I am, is largely a result of how I've seen myself, and I've built this up over time. So if my self-image, my self-value, my self-worth, that's my interpretation of the way the world around me interacts with me. But it's also largely dependent on how I interpret myself. I would argue this is the actually polar opposite of American society. And we see this a lot with American relationships, especially with things like social media. Where suddenly your TikTok and your other accounts, people start to do nothing but dish you. It doesn't seem to make any difference. To be honest, from a generation that predates social media, I've never really understood, well, and also being more ikigai oriented, I've never really figured out why I should care what people I don't know say about me. If I don't know them, I don't know what their criteria are. So, why should I pay much attention to their evaluation of my behavior? I don't know who they are. So why would I waste, and the reverse that be, why would I waste my time evaluating their behavior if I don't know who they are? So now you think about all the huge part of social media, you start dissing on people you don't know and you've never met, and people diss on you, when you post something and they've never met you and they don't know where it's coming from. It's like watching smoke disappear into this, into the atmosphere. It's like, why would it be of any concern to anybody? Why would anyone even waste their time with their thumbs on a phone? But in American society, American identity, American sense of self and value, self-worth is almost entirely based on others. So if you would, Americans use how others look at them as the mirror from which they develop their sense of self-worth. So Americans are entirely, I would argue, externally oriented on self-worth, self-value. Japanese are almost entirely based on internal, over time builds of self-value. Now, this doesn't mean they're based in reality. Both groups, I would argue, equally unrealistic. And in American society, are based on, you think about it, you're based on a group of strangers who, especially with social media and something like, TikTok, is people you've never met, you don't know where they're from. It's a good bet their account names are fake. That the profile they have isn't even an accurate reflection of who they are, because it could be like a 6-year-old kid dissing your ass. And yet you're going to actually look at yourself and say, well, I'm a failure because, so and so crapped on my parade publicly on TikTok. It's like, who gives a shit? But on the other hand, that's how Americans judge their value on how others react to them. So if you would, Americans are always actors and actresses on the stage, and they're always performing. And you can see this, I hate to say it, but if you look in the mirror, if you're a classic Anglo-American behavioral wise, you can see this when you look in the mirror or look at your TikTok and Instagram accounts. And you can also think about this with the folks around you. Now, someone can go into a massive depression because suddenly everyone started dissing a photo they, presented of themselves, and all of a sudden, oh, they're too fat, or they look too old, they look too funny, or that's an ugly outfit. Like who gives it? You don't even know who these people are. So why should it matter? And that's how Japanese see it. Japanese use social media a lot, but their view of what people say on social media tends to be very, very different than the American counterpart. Chinese view social media as basically a modern, unidirectional text form of gossip. So they too see social media very differently than their American counterparts. It might have some of the similar impacts, but that's because to the Chinese, any critique is a critique of the group to a certain extent. Yeah, so I mean, this is where Japanese look at Americans, whether it be from the president on down, and their consumption of social media, their presentation of self on social media, and they just sort of like, what? They don't understand it. And to be honest, I'm sort of on their side. I don't understand it either. But then I'm a dinosaur type fossil, so who knows? But the other hand, what you get is your self-value, self-worth, and you frequently see this with Japanese, is totally not based in reality. Now, this is where, again, Japanese are different than Chinese. Chinese, on one hand, have a sense of self-worth. It's, in part internally developed, but that's also got the constraints of sort of reality. So Chinese, I would argue, tend to have a sense of self-worth, self-value that can pretty out of touch with things, but at some point or another, they sort of reel themselves in. I would argue the Japanese don't. Japanese can go through their entire lives with a sense of who they are that bears no relationship to the world or the life history that they've got. I don't know why this happens particularly. You would think that at some point they're still tied to reality, but then Americans have an equally bad sense of their relationship with reality. It's just based on external forces versus Japanese internal identity. So Japanese can have this strange thing where they think they're going to be good at something, or they think they have a natural aptitude. This is where you usually see it. Japanese still think they have a natural aptitude for something, and they've got absolutely no aptitude for it. But somewhere along the line, as they were growing up, they sort of built into their self-identity, oh, I'm good at this. I know with my relatives who are largely Chinese, they see this a lot. For example, golf. Where you'll get Japanese who just think they're kick-ass. They could be, I don't know what the pro, was it PGA or whatever, the pro golfer. They could be a pro golfer with no trouble at all. And it's just, but they've got to work a regular job. In fact, I remember talking to we worked with Cebu Corporation a bunch in the 70s, who actually developed most of what's now Makena, Wailea, and Maui. And we were talking when they set up the shop. We were actually talking. We used to hang out with one of the golf pros there who was Japanese. And he brought this up. Wealthy Japanese would come to Hawaii and go to the Cebu hotels, and he is the golf pro and, have to teach these guys how to play golf better. And he said it was really hard because, if you get him drinking, he had these funny stories because it'd be sort of like, yeah, these guys come in, they think they can kick my ass. And he actually is a pro, it's just a matter of, well, so if the shot goes off and hits a tree or hits somebody or, goes, whatever happens, it was either the club was bad, the wind did something, they got distracted. In other words, they have a bazillion excuses, but it's never the fact that they don't have the skill set, that they don't have the coordination to swing a golf club properly. That's not even going to be part of their interpretation of the situation. And he said, there's nothing you can do to do anything about it. And he said, you don't go down that path because that's going to be ugly. There's no way out of it, and there's no way you're going to win. So he said, oh yeah, you're doing better. Yeah. That club's just not a good fit. And whatever you can do, you support their excuses because the alternative is not going to be pretty. So Ikigai is absolutely fascinating. I strongly suggest that if there was some way to do it, Americans should develop. In fact, we were working on a software hardware package to actually help folks do this for a while. I still think that this is something Americans desperately need, especially in a world of social media. You need to have ikigai, and this has to be internally developed in a world which is, basically the minute whether you're on the phone or not, your social media platforms are up constantly. So you might not be logged into Instagram or TikTok, but Instagram and TikTok are still on, and everyone's still surfing around it. And everyone's still going to either diss or support what you are, on your account, regardless of whether you're in it or not. So yeah, ikigai is especially for Americans, they need it desperately. They need to have some way to wean themselves off, surviving on with identity based on externality. That's insane in the world we live in. Okay. Okay. Let me do a few of these and I'll stop. First is the idea of debt. Well, this isn't like to a bank or to a car dealership or something like that. This is the idea of social emotional debt. So in Japanese society, again, Chinese are actually bigger on this than Japanese are. In Japanese society, the idea of on or debt is the idea of being indebted to someone. So to a certain extent, the kids, that image we saw, they're indebted to the teacher because in some way, shape, or form, the teacher, taught them the materials, got them through the year, has hopefully made them better students, hopefully made them, at least in their view, for some of them, it's given them a chance to get into a good university and get a future that maybe they weren't sure they were going to have. So on one hand, they owe the teacher a lot. Now the problem is, how do you pay that back? Now notice this is also a huge part then of Amae. The kid generator half of the Amae relationship owes the sponge part of the relationship for putting up with the kid part. So to be indebted is to be Japanese. To be indebted to a huge network, almost like a spider web of people, is to be Japanese. The fact that you're never going to pay off those debts is something that people get resigned to. But you still owe everyone. So now what that also means then for folks outside of your social network, the folks outside of the neighborhood, outside of the, a mind network that you built up over your life, you don't owe them squat. So you can treat them and do anything that you want to them. And I would argue in part, this is why you see the Japanese attitude towards non-Japanese that manifested itself in the first half of the 20th century. You can slaughter Koreans or Chinese. You can, do absolutely brutal things to prisoners of war. Why? Because there's no social relationship. There's no Amae relationship. They're not someone who's anything to you. And so therefore they're outside of this system of debt and in debt. And what that also means, there's no moral ethical compass for your behavior. It's hard to understand how Japanese have behaved in the last, especially 100 years, unless you understand that the scary thing about debt is when that doesn't exist. Then basically means that, all moral ethical values are absent. Doesn't mean that someone's going to do something bad. It just means there's nothing stopping them from doing something bad. Loyalty, we've already been through that. That should be sort of straightforward, just because when you think of these relationships, the loyalty is the key part of any of my relationship. It's always based on the idea that this is perpetual, it's permanent. You don't break loyalty. Having said that, because loyalty is based on a network of people, not institutions, this is why very frequently in Japanese history you can see, in fact, when the prime minister was sort of tossed out and the lady came into charge just recently, she's part of his party, but her branch of the party was perfectly happily throwing him to the lions, even though theoretically they're loyal to the party. What they're actually loyal is to a faction. I'm not sure who her oidaben is. She's Koban to somebody, and the senior statesman that put her, up to be the prime minister, is who she's loyal to. Now, to a certain extent, she's loyal to Japan, but what she's really loyal to is that faction she's a part of. That's not to diss her. She's from what I can already see just a little bit, she's pretty impressive. But loyalty it's not to a conceptual collective. It's, as I mentioned before, it's not to Matsushita or Sony. It's to the Oyaben Koban relationships, the social network that you've built up. That loyalty is immutable. But there's no loyalty outside of that because if you think about that, again, there's no debt, there's no own there. Two is the concept of loyalty. But notice again, this is going to be individually interpreted. So again, go back to Ikigai. My sense of who I am is largely based on, my own building of that if I'm Japanese. So how I interpret debt, how I interpret loyalty is going to be based on me. It's not going to be based on how what I've done that's been posted on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, or Weibo. So, it's on one hand, it makes Japanese society very simple. If you're not in a system with people, if you're not in a network with somebody, then you, to a certain extent, you're not relevant to them. Because most folks, by the time they're even the age of those kids, already have a huge pile of folks that they are indebted to, that they are loyal to, that there's expectations of, and that have expectations of them. They have very little room for building more relationships. You don't score points by the number of friends you have. And so, going back to the idea of Instagram and stuff like that, the size of followers you have, that you're an influencer, which to the Japanese just seems sort of silly because those folks really aren't followers. They don't know you, you don't know them. So filial piety, this is a term that was when Euro-American anthropologists and sociologists and psychologists first started looking at Asian societies. And this was a term they started using a lot. I'm not sure. I never bothered to go back far enough into anthropological, psychological theory to figure out where the term first pops up. God knows it was probably Jung or Freud. Actually, I would guess just cynically it's probably Freud. But anyways, filial piety is the term that gets used a lot when people sort of talk about Asian societies, unquote. And there actually is true. This means that you respect and obey your seniors, specifically your parents, but also your seniors in a company. But notice it's not all the seniors in the company, it's your oyabun. And indirectly, it's the seniors, it's the oyabans of your oyabun. Because remember, everyone goes through junior seniors. So on one hand, you're directly responsible for obeying, supporting, etc. And pretty much without question, you're oyabun. On the other hand, that means that you've also got a group of people above him or her that you've got to support because they're your oyabun's oyabun, because in that situation, he's the koban, he's the junior. So this is that sort of social ladder. It's almost like a rope ladder, I suppose, of these relationships. And someone like the prime minister is a good example of that. She's part of one of these ladders. She's not the top rung. She might be one of the top people in terms of technical position, but she's not the top rung. There's folks that she is beholden to or she owes. And there's folks that she's by definition loyal. Now, those aren't her parents. Her parents would be a packaged part of that, especially if you're in the public eye in Japan, as politicians are. There's no way that you aren't going to be visibly, helping out and doing stuff for your parents. It's like part of the checklist you're going to check off. So filial piety is the idea that piety is a bad term. Piety implies religion. In Japanese society, I would argue that social behavior isn't religion, but it is a given in the sense that these aren't subject to negotiation. How they're manifest will vary from person to person, but their existence is defined. But notice how it doesn't mean the corporation, doesn't mean the state, it doesn't mean Japan, it doesn't mean whatever. It's a subset of that. Let's stop there. That's a good place to stop, I think.